Hello, and welcome to Recall This Book. Today, your hosts are me, lifelong sci-fi fanatic and devoted Liu Cixin fan John Plotz, and my friend Professor Pu Wang, author of The Translatability of Revolution from Harvard University Press, and recently tenured Associate Professor of German, Russian, and Asian Literature here at Brandeis. And we are especially honored today to be interviewing the renowned Chinese science fiction writer Liu Cixin, author of the best-selling and also really, truly mind-bending science fiction trilogy, The Three-Body Problem. Last year, my colleagues and I organized a one-day conference about that work. And today, Mr. Liu is here at Brandeis to receive an honorary degree. So we are so pleased that he, in turn, has honored us with a visit to our underground den. So, Mr. Liu, hello. 你好,欢迎.
你好.
So Pooh and I have written these questions together, but I'm going to ask them in English, and Pooh is going to translate Mr. Liu's responses. So let me begin with our first question. When you began to be a writer, what sort of things did you write? And when did you begin to write science fiction?
我的这个写科幻的过程十分的简单，因为我到现在我只写过科幻小说，没有写过别的，也不会写。
So my experience of writing actually was quite simple. I only wrote science fiction. I started with science fiction and I ended up being a science fiction writer. So I started as a big fan of science fiction. And in that sense, I might be the first generation of Chinese writers who engaged science fiction self-consciously. Which means we wanted to become science fiction writers as such. Here I wanted to further clarify the differences between the fans of science fiction and the writers of science fiction. I was a big fan of science fiction, and that was a new subculture in China. And I was the first generation self-conscious fans of science fiction.
Yeah.
But science fiction writers, of course, existed much earlier than I started my work. But I think in terms of a subculture of science fiction, we were the first generation that generated that kind of self-consciousness.
Yeah. Actually, Mr. Liu, I do have a follow-up about that. That's really interesting. Can you talk about how that subculture existed? Was it connected by magazines, or was there an online culture, or was it books that you read in translation, or books by other Chinese writers? Like, what was the material connection that you had that made you a fandom, a part of a fan group?
So I started my fascination with science fiction when I was a primary school student. That was still the final years of Cultural Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no cultural landscape of media as we know today. And there was not even the concept of science fiction yet in China. So back then, what I read was the translated Chinese science fiction from the 50s, the period of early People's Republic, the early socialist period.
Mm-hmm.
That was a relatively culturally open era. In the 50s, a lot of Western science fiction works were translated into China. Those books belonged to my father,
Mm-hmm.
and during the Cultural Revolution, those books were no longer considered orthodox enough, politically orthodox enough. So my father just put them underneath the bed. So as a young boy, I just sneak under the bed and started to read those works. Among those authors, Jules Verne, George Wells, and also Soviet science fiction writers.
No, yeah, Soviet science fiction. Interesting. Yeah. And was that community, was that pretty much all boys who were part of that fandom, or boys and girls together, or young men and women? Who were the other fans of science fiction?
So this reading experience of mine was very private, very intimate.
I see. Mm-hmm.
So I don't. Back then, I didn't even want to let others know I was reading this kind of books.
Yeah.
So, were there any other young boys, young girls doing the same thing?
Yeah.
I don't know, because this kind of reading just made me like an isolated island.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. So I think this second question is related, but it's a question of what writers had an influence on you, and you just talked about how you came to know some of them, and then the related question is other artists, whether there were poets or painters or filmmakers, who also had that kind of impact that you're describing with Jules Verne or H.G. Wells.
So I would like to divide the writers of great influence on me into two categories. One is the mainstream canonical writers. The other is the group of science fiction writers.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to the first category of mainstream canonical series literature, the biggest influence was Golden Age Russian literature. Tolstoy was definitely one of the biggest influences.
Yeah.
So I once had a misunderstanding or misperception of my fascination with Russian literature. I attributed this fascination to the historical conditions, because in that era, Russian literature was quite dominant on the Chinese cultural front, and I once believed that my love for Russian Revolution, Russian literature, was also part of this cultural movement. But why think again? Why look back again? The most intensive literary reading of mine started to take place during my middle school and high school years. That was already the beginning of the age of reforms, of opening up. A lot of Western literary works were introduced, translated into China, including a lot of Western European and North American works, in addition to Russian works. So, if we take this into consideration, then probably my love for Russian literature, especially Tolstoy's huge influence on me, is attributable simply to my personality.
Yeah. So that is so fascinating. I'm reading War and Peace right now, and it just remembering the capacity to build the world, like the way that Tolstoy creates the war spaces, the peace spaces. They seem to be disconnected, but then they're together. Can you talk more about how you compare your own work to Tolstoy? That makes a lot of sense to me.
The same here. My favorite Tolstoy is also War and Peace.
Yeah, okay.
That's the biggest influence on me. I think there are two reasons why I love War and Peace so much. The first one, of course, is the panoramic totality of historical world that Tolstoy created. That kind of grand narrative is simply powerful for me. But another reason is also the Russianness of this work, deeply rooted in its Russian spirit. There is a sense of profundity that really overwhelms me. In my later work, there are always echoes and shadows of Tolstoy's War and Peace, but for me, these are simply very, very low-level parodies that cannot even begin to match Tolstoy's profundity.
Okay. So I think that connects. The final part of that question is about philosophy or spiritual writing, and in a way, you've described Tolstoy as having a philosophical effect on you. But whether there are other writers of philosophy or...
Before going to the question of philosophy and spirituality, I want to go back to the question of filmmaker. Kubrick is my favorite. Of course, 2001 is a classic. I love, but all of his works have a lot of influence on me. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think this year is the 60th anniversary of the making of 2001.
I think so. Yeah.
So for
50th. Yeah. 69.
So for a fan of science fiction like me, this film is has the status of as the Bible.
Yeah.
So last month in Beijing, together with many other science fiction writers and critics, I saw the digitally repaired version of 2001.
Yeah, I just saw it too
Yeah.
with my daughter. Yeah.
And all of us
Yeah.
were like pilgrims,
Yeah.
not just moviegoers.
Yeah.
So I have many poets and painters that I admire, but in terms of influence, they cannot compare to what I have just mentioned.
Okay. Great.
So now let's turn to the question of philosophy and spirituality. In terms of religion, I'm an atheist, so I don't think any religion has a particular bearing on me. So let me focus on the philosophical influence I've received. Philosophy has a profound impact on me because, in my view, if we compare science and philosophy, which one is closer to science fiction? Actually, philosophy is closer.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
science fiction.
Okay.
So if we take science as a worldview, then according to this worldview, there's only one single image of the world. But philosophy is entirely different. Every philosopher has his or her own world picture, and every world picture is so different from the other. So if we have an alien coming from outside this universe, they're going to totally be puzzled by the debates between our philosophers because it doesn't feel like they are talking about the same world. So in this regard, philosophy is closest to science fiction because different writers of science fiction are striving to create different world images of social formation, of history, of the universe. Of course, the way I receive influence from our philosophers might be different from other people's pursuit of philosophical insight. For others, they might want to find the truth in a philosophical discourse. But for me, every philosophical discourse will be judged by one standard, that is whether it's interesting, whether there's a story to tell. So a really curious outcome of this is that some radically opposing philosophical schools have equal influence on me. For example, idealism, of course, is so vastly different from materialism. But for me, they are both sources of inspiration.
So I think this connects actually to our next question, which is about the Chinese term Keihuan, which is an acronym meaning science and fantasy. So the question is about science as a concept or a discourse. It can refer to a discipline of national sciences, but also it designates the method shared by disciplines. And Mr. Liu, I think this is what you were just talking about with positivism or empiricism in science. And it also means a worldview, a way of thinking and reasoning and of modern enlightenment. But, and this is important for science fiction, it is sometimes confused with technology, which creates its own kind of world picture. So as an engineer, as a science fiction writer, living in this post-Einstein technological world, what is your sense, what is your definition of science?
This is indeed a very complicated issue, especially when it comes to science relationship with technology.
Technology, yeah.
First off, technology precedes science. Way before the rise of modern science, there were so many technologies, there's so many technological innovations. But today's technological saturation is deeply embedded to the development of science. So basically, science, in our contemporary world, science sets a glass ceiling for technology. So the degree of technological development is predetermined by the advances of science. But what is remarkably interesting here is that how technology becomes so interconnected with science. In ancient Greek world, science develops out of logic, out of reasoning. There's no kind of reliance of science on technology. So the big game changer is Galileo's methods of putting experiments into place in order to prove a theory and then putting theory back into experimentation. Starting from there, science had to rely on technology.
Yeah.
So this kind of reliance becomes stronger and stronger up to date. So today the frontiers of physics are totally conditioned in the development of technology. This is unprecedented.
Right.
So back in China, there has been a huge debate about whether we need to build a new accelerator. But the investment on this construction has a price tag of 100 billion RMB. So, but what you can get with today's technological accelerator is still far away from what you need for a experiment in the most advanced physics.
Yeah.
The difference is 11 zeros.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of poetic nickname for this difference, that is a desert of physics. So because this huge gap, the most advanced theory of modern physics cannot be verified or disverified. Therefore, this is a major symptom of science reliance on technology.
Yeah. I know we have so much to talk about, but it would be really interesting to think about mathematics in this respect too. Whether you think of mathematics as among the sciences or in a kind of perpendicular relationship, because mathematics doesn't need that kind of empiricism. Like people do math by computers, but mathematics, it's interesting to think about, do you think of math as among the sciences or sort of next to the sciences?
It's curious to see which side we want to be, because some people will say mathematics does not belong to science. But even if we say mathematics is part of science, mathematics is an exceptional case because it does not rely on technology. So following up on the science reliance on technology, I would like to point to a very paradoxical phenomenon. So right now we can see technology is based on the advances of science, and science has to rely on technology for self-verification. If has ever been a kind of a really good circularity here, I would like to say that's the golden age of modern physics in the early 20th century. But we have today, what we have today might be a vicious circle. That is, actually, science and technology are mutually limited by each other. And I would like to even put it in this way. They are mutually locked by each other in their own development. So if we compare science as a fruit tree, those fruits that are within our reach are already picked.
Yeah.
So the most important, the most pioneering part is totally beyond our reach.
Yeah.
So what can we do? We then turn to information and communication.
Yeah.
Beyond information and communication, it seems to me there's no breakthrough in our near side.
So is there a way to think about that vicious circle from the outside? Can science fiction itself have a role to play in changing that locked relationship? In other words, is there just like a different way of thinking about it?
You've assigned a mission of science fiction that is too sublime, too solid.
Superman.
I continue to see science fiction as part of popular culture if it can help the humans, if it can help the readers open up their horizon, inspire them to explore even more. That would be a huge success already.
Okay, yes. So I think this relates to our next question, which is the second element of the term, Kehuan, that is fantasy. So the question would be about the relationship between fantasy and the real, or the word realism, which is obviously a key part of modern fiction. And so the question would be about realism and does realism have a role in your literary formation? Do you think of science fiction as a form of realism?
My personal view is that there should not be just one single paradigm for science fiction. There should be various kinds of science fiction. So, of course, some writers will use science fiction, will use the element of fantasy to allegorize reality, to be critical of reality, and to represent and reflect upon reality. This kind of science fiction gained a particular term in Chinese. Chinese critics like to call this kind of science fiction as science fantasy realism. But for me, I'm not interested in this approach, in this tradition, and in this tendency. I'm not interested in allegorizing, criticizing, and representing reality. For me, the most valuable, the most precious part of science fiction is that we can build a world entirely based on imagination. That kind of pure, everything is purely up in the air. That kind of fantastic imagination is why I love science fiction. I remember one historian said this. So what is the difference between human species from other species? That is, we have the capability of using our imagination to build something.
And yet you love Tolstoy also. And Tolstoy, he builds, but he builds inside the Napoleonic War. So do you see what you're doing as like Tolstoy? Do you know what I mean? The realism in Tolstoy is that he's committed to the facts that we already know happened, and then the imagination is inside that. Do you? Yeah.
Then let me tell you what role realism plays in my work. For me, realism is the platform, is the takeoff ground for my imagination. But I start with realism, but my goal is to reach the pure imaginary. So going back to the role of imagination, the role the imagination played in our evolution as human species. Looking ahead, this imagination, this creation of non-actual might be the only capability with which we can surpass artificial intelligence. So I think we should not drag science fiction down from the level fantasy down to the level of realism. Rather, I would like to have science fiction up in the air, creating something that is totally non-actual. But there is also a kind of a question of practical consideration. For Chinese readers, they like to start with representation of reality. This is vastly different from the tradition of Western science fiction. Western science fiction sometimes drags the airs of the reader and then lift everyone off the ground and throw everyone into the thin air. But for Chinese reader, you need to have a slow build up of this fantasy. So you still need realism.
No.
To further explain the role of realism in my work, we can use the metaphor of kite. My imagination can be high in the air, but we still have a thin line linking it back to reality. That seems to be a stabilizing force in my work.
And so that would be a distinction from fantasy. Is that right?
Yes, I do feel, that's what distinguishes my work from fantasy. The genre of fantasy, in my view, is different from the genre of science fiction, even though in Chinese, science fiction can mean science fantasy. Science fiction is surreal, but never supernatural. But in the genre of fantasy, you can go supernatural. So this leads me back to my kind of interpretation of mythology. So we have a kind of misunderstanding of mythology today. We believe that mythology is fiction. But think of the primitives who are the recipient of mythology. For them, mythology is reality. In our contemporary culture, I think science fiction is the only literary genre that can replace the role of mythology. Because in science fiction, even though it's pure fantasy, there is a sense of truthfulness. Whereas the genre of fantasy will never be able to provide that sense of truthfulness.
Yeah, I see that. So I think your last answer connects with our question about virtual reality. And so, in the first volume of your wonderful three-body problem trilogy, it begins both with real history and, of course, with the idea of virtual reality, the online game of the three-body problem. And we're very interested in that idea of the setting of the VR game, which is a narrative strategy that enables a representation of something that is, by nature, unrepresentable. So the question is about how you think about virtual reality and the new frontier of the virtual universe, which is created both in the inward-looking individual and the community by all kinds of innovative new media, by social media, video games, online communication. And so one simple form of the question, are you a big fan of video games, of virtual reality devices, or apps, or platforms of social media? Have you been really interested and immersed in that kind of subculture? So that would maybe be a beginning way of that question.
So I'm totally open to the media inversion, the age of media-related innovations. I'm not in resistance against this trend. Although I have to admit, my screen time is kind of limited, and it is reserved in general to work-related matters. I'm actually quite interested in spending more time on the screen, but it's just because I'm too busy. For a short period of time, I was really passionate about video game, but that was the video game before internet. That was the time when Windows was not yet out there. But how did that fascination disappear? Looking back, I would say that's because I got super busy with my work, with my family. So that the love for video game started to take the back seat.
Yeah.
For me, I think today we need to pay attention to one important tendency, a trend of information technology. The advances of information technologies create a new situation in which many of our desires and needs can be met in virtuality or in the world of internet. So as of now, as we're talking, I think the human desires that can be fulfilled in virtuality, in internet, only account for a small fraction of human desires. But I have no doubt that in the future, maybe in near future, almost all human desires, or let's say all human desires, can be fulfilled in the world created by VR, AI, and the internet. So for me, the immediate outcome of this is a change of humanity. The human civilization will be changed from an outlooking civilization into an inward-looking civilization. So how do I differentiate these two types of human civilization? For me, the outward-looking civilization is defined by the age of great ocean navigations, the discovery of new continents. That's a desire of discovering new grounds of human development. Whereas in the probably future inward-looking civilization, this desire seems to be non-functional. In the short term, an inward-looking civilization is a civilization of happiness. Everyone is happy. But in the long term, there's no future prospects for the inward-looking civilization. So I have a solid belief. This might just be me, but this is my solid belief. We might have a really prosperous future in store for us. But if in that future there's no interstellar travel, for me, this is not a good future for humans. So I have a horrible dystopia in my mind. That is, in that future of inward-looking civilization, the Earth, the ecology of the Earth will be restored. You will have reforestation. You will have the best ecological surface of the world. And then in this world, you cannot see any single human individual. You only have a huge cave in which you have a super computer. In that supercomputer live 10 billion human beings, and these 10 billion human beings are happy. And for me, this happiness is horrible. We already have some signs of that kind of life. Let's take any big metropolitan cities. If you live in Beijing or New York, from your birth certificate to your death certificate, you do not need to leave a room that has Wi-Fi. So you can spend all your life in a internet environment.
Wow, that is a dark vision for technology and for science. Like the Machine Stops by E.M. Forster. Do you know this story? E.M. Forster.
我看过 I see.
Everyone lives underground inside a honeycomb. It's like bees in a honeycomb.
So think about it. E.M. Forster, his work, I think, is from early 20th century.
Yeah.
It's already predicted.
Yeah. Can we ask you a question about translation? So your masterpieces are read and interpreted all over the world. Non-Chinese speakers like me come to this work through translation. and I've met your translator, actually, Ken Liu, here in Boston. During your early years, you read science fiction classics like Verne and Wells in Chinese translation. So the question is, how do you feel about being translated? Are you worried about things being lost in translation? Or are you excited about translation as a second life, as something that would be gained in transcultural rewriting?
Conventionally speaking, we believe, there has to be a certain laws between two languages when we do translingual translation.
Mm-hmm.
The more the writers root their works deeply into their national cultures, the more loss they face in translation. My example is Mo Yan, who received a Nobel Prize less a decade ago. I think to translate Mo Yan means you have to lose something that is truly Chinese. But in this regard, science fiction is a happy exception.
I see. Yeah.
Because in China, science fiction is 100% foreign importation. So, for example, many concepts we use in Chinese science fiction are originally Western concepts, Western words, Western terms, and therefore it's a little bit easier for our translators to bring them back to Western languages. More important is the nature of science fiction as a form of fictional storytelling. In a story of science fiction, humanity always appears in its totality rather than in different nations. Therefore, in line of this, we can follow. We can also say, science fiction poses the questions that are shared by the whole human community. Science fiction does not simply pose questions that are unique to a single ethnic group, one single community, or one single nation state. Since science fiction responds to the crises confronting humanity as a whole, science fiction becomes a genre that is particularly suitable for transnational, transcultural communication. When it comes to my own work, I'm particularly lucky, and I'm luckier than most of science fiction writers. So I have two really wonderful translators, and so when my work is in their hands, I can assure you my work is not lost in translation. My work gains a lot in translation. So it's no exaggeration on my part to say that the literary quality of my English translation is better than my original.
Yeah.
And
I don't believe that.
if you can read in English, then just go by my English by the English translation of my work.
So we actually have a related question, which is not about translation, but about adaptation. So the sort of next question, specifically, the Wandering Earth was just turned into a film, but I was wondering about the question of adaptation of science fiction that is originally written gets turned into film. So you talked about Kubrick before and what an impact he had on you. So clearly, science fiction can live as film or it can live as words on the page. What is your thought about that kind of translation, the adaptation from the page onto the screen?
This is yet another firm belief of mine. That is, science fiction is particularly suitable to visual representation, even more suitable than the literary form. So for traditional science fiction writers, they seem to have a kind of obsession with the power of language, of the magical literary power of language. But it, even if we acknowledge that kind of literary power, we have to say, in face of science fiction imagination, that power is still weak. As science fiction deals with non-actual worlds that has never existed in reality, the mere medium of language is sometimes not sufficient. So I try really hard to use language to match the immense images in my mind. But eventually I have to say I failed. So, for example, the long passage of my description of the travel of the Earth through a solar system, it's a long passage, but I don't think it's successful. But in the film, it's just 1 second, and it's very effective.
Were you involved? Did you speak with the director or the screenwriters as the film was being made? Was that vision of the film? Was it your vision?
My view is that literature and film are two entirely different form of art. I would like to leave a great room of creative freedom for the filmmakers. So I participated, but my participation was very limited. Judging from the history of cinema, so when an original author was involved in film adaptation, it will always mean catastrophe. It will always mean trouble, because the original author would be very easy trapped in a self-centered, persistent narcissism, and that would never help the film adaptation at all.
So this is a very open-ended question, but do you think of yourself as having a message or messages for your audiences?
So 90% of my efforts are about telling a creative, compelling story. The focus is always, for my striving as a writer, the focus is always the compelling storytelling. If there's some message in my work, that's either an afterthought when the work is finished, or the interpretation of my beloved critics. So going back to your question, is there a thematic allegorical drive? Is there a allegorical message I want to convey? I don't think so. In particular, I'm always fascinated and surprised by how rich the interpretation of my work has become. So many rich implications of my work are never in my mind, but they have been produced by the interpreters.
So I think we have a final pair of questions, and the question is what you think the future of science fiction is. And I think we could think about, is this future in writing? Is it in film? Maybe is it in virtual reality or in AI? And then more specifically, a question about the future of your own writing. Where do you think you're heading next? What sort of projects are you working on?
First off, I think the future of science fiction is very uncertain. And in this regard, it's very similar to any literary form. It doesn't matter it's in this country, that is United States, or elsewhere. The golden age of science fiction is gone. We are already in the age of decline. So I was said, we're trying to sail the boat while the boat is sinking. China might be an exception because of the rapid modernization, because of the futurity of contemporary Chinese life. There is still rich soil for science fiction to grow. So there is a bright prospect of science fiction in China, but not for science fiction literature. It's for science fiction cinema and TV shows. Both the size of the community of science fiction writers and the size of the reader population are pretty are relatively small in China even today. So for science fiction as a literary genre, the future is definitely not bright. As a writer, of course, I will continue to write, and my goal is to try something that I haven't touched upon. But in the meanwhile, I would like to devote a certain amount of my energy to the adaptation of science fiction in film and TV.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think for Chinese science fiction blockbusters, the prospect is really bright, and I even believe in near future, Chinese science fiction cinema may be on the equal footing with Hollywood. China will be an alternative to Hollywood in terms of producing science fiction blockbusters.
Can I ask you more when you say adaptation? Do you mean, will you write original things for film and TV, or will you take your own work and turn it into film and television?
So I don't believe I will try my hands on the writing of screenplays. I don't think an original literary writer will be a good screenplay writer. I think the best way for me to move forward is to create original literary works of science fiction and then let the industry of cinema do the adaptation. Screenplay writer has no freedom. His or her freedom is limited by the producing company, by the censorship, and by the market. But as a literary writer, I have the freedom. That's what I enjoy, and that's what I can. I really detest that kind of situation that every screenplay writer finds him or her in. That is, whenever you write a line, you need to think about whether my audience will like it or dislike it. I hate that. For science fiction movie screenplay rights, this is a kind of inevitable imprisonment of all these calculations, because science fiction blockbuster has a really high budget. You have to take that into consideration and think about audience. As a writer, I don't want to do that.
Pooh, do you have any final questions?
Actually, I think I'm fine. So I think time is perfect.
Yeah, I think the timing is perfect. So, Mr. Liu, thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. It's a huge pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.